let the story unfold. Chapter 1. Morning Roses at Gossington Hall. There are mornings in early June when the English countryside arranges itself with such quiet perfection that one is almost reluctant to disturb it with thought. The light arrives gently without urgency, settling across lawns and garden walls in that particular shade of gold that belongs exclusively to the hours before 9 o'clock. Birdsong fills the spaces between things. The air carries the mingled sweetness of grass and blossom, and the whole world seems, for a brief and merciful interval, to be entirely at peace with itself. It was precisely such a morning when Miss Jane Marple made her way along the familiar lane that led from the village of St. Mary Mead toward the gates of Gossington Hall. She walked at her customary pace, which appeared unhurried to any observer, but which, in practice, covered a good deal of ground, and she carried her knitting bag over one arm as was her habit, though she had no present intention of knitting. The bag was, in truth, less a practical object than a companion, and she had carried it so long that its absence would have felt peculiar. Gossington Hall stood at the end of a gravel drive lined on both sides with lime trees whose canopy, in early June, formed a long green tunnel of shade and dappled light. The hall itself was of warm Cotswold stone, not especially grand by the standards of the county, but handsome and well proportioned, with tall windows that caught the morning sun and returned it as something friendlier than mere brightness. The gardens surrounding it were, by general agreement among those who cared about such things, among the finest in the district. Miss Marple had been invited to take tea at the Hall several days earlier by her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had telephoned in that warm, slightly breathless manner she had when she wished to share something pleasurable. The Rose Pavilion, Dolly had explained, had been quite beautifully restored over the winter months, and the ornamental pond beside it had been re-edged with fresh stone. One really must come and see it. And Miss Marple, who was genuinely fond of roses and equally fond of Dolly Bantry, had agreed with sincere pleasure. The tea had been delightful, as Dolly's teas invariably were. They had walked together afterward along the garden path that curved past the herbaceous borders and descended gently toward the far end of the grounds, where the Rose Pavilion stood reflected in the still surface of the ornamental pond. It was a charming structure, open on 3 sides, with a slender roof of green-painted timber and climbing roses trained along its supporting columns. Inside, a marble table occupied the centre, flanked by several cane chairs of the old-fashioned sort that invite one to sit and remain sitting for rather longer than one had intended. Dolly had spoken of the new roses with evident pride, and Miss Marple had admired them sincerely. It had been during that afternoon visit that Miss Marple had first made the acquaintance of the guests currently staying at the Hall. Mr. Adrian Fenton had been introduced by Dolly, with a slightly self-conscious air that suggested she was not entirely certain how to place him. He was a gentleman of perhaps 50, slim and upright in bearing, with a pleasant enough face that nonetheless gave little away. He had arrived from London some weeks earlier, Dolly had mentioned in a whispered aside, and had extended his visit once, and then again, in a manner that was perfectly agreeable, but which had somewhat exceeded the original understanding. He spoke well and listened attentively. He had the manner of a man accustomed to observing rather than participating, which Miss Marple, who shared the same tendency, recognised at once and found quietly interesting. He had been courteous toward her, asked sensible questions about the village, and expressed a particular admiration for the pavilion garden, though his eyes, she noticed, had rested rather more on the hall itself than on its flower-beds. Mrs. Celia Fortescue was a woman of 60 or thereabouts, handsome in a determined way, and possessed of that particular social ease which announces itself as warmth, but is upon closer acquaintance something rather more calculated. She was a distant cousin of the Bantry family on the maternal side, a connection that she neither emphasised nor entirely concealed. She admired village life with great enthusiasm, spoke feelingly about the beauty of old gardens and the virtues of country simplicity, and wore mas. On the afternoon of Miss Marple's visit, a dress of dove-grey silk that was rather too well considered for a quiet country tea. She had greeted Miss Marple with charming cordiality, and had spoken at some length about the loveliness of the pavilion roses, but Miss Marple had observed with mild interest that she had not once looked at the roses while she spoke of them. Mr. Philip Arden was a quieter presence altogether. He was perhaps 45, with an unremarkable face and the careful, restrained manner of a man whose profession had taught him to say only what was necessary. He was, Dolly had explained, a financial adviser who had on several occasions assisted with certain matters connected to the estate, and who visited the Hall from time to time when his services were required. He had been polite to Miss Marple in a distant, correct way, and had exchanged a few remarks with Mr. Fenton that had an understandably professional quality about them, though their precise subject had not been made clear. Miss Judith Marlowe was the youngest of the guests, a young woman of perhaps 28, with bright eyes and an air of intelligent enthusiasm that Miss Marple found rather appealing. She was, she explained with unpretentious frankness, a writer engaged in researching the local history of this part of the county, a project that had brought her to Gossington Hall chiefly because of certain parish records and estate documents to which Dolly had generously allowed her access. She was the sort of young woman who asked good questions and genuinely listened to the answers, and Miss Marple had enjoyed their brief conversation that afternoon considerably. Dolly Bantry herself was, as ever, a source of uncomplicated pleasure. She was a large, kind, comfortable woman who managed her house and her garden and her opinions with cheerful directness, and who had been Miss Marple's friend for a great many years. She worried about her roses, her cook, and the creeping damp in the east corridor, roughly in that order of priority, and she faced the minor complications of life with an energetic goodwill that Miss Marple had always admired. It was the following morning after that pleasant afternoon visit that Miss Marple received a telephone call from Dolly, the tone of which was quite different from any that had preceded it. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled but not entirely steady. Thomas, the senior gardener, had gone down to the pavilion shortly after 7 o'clock to attend to the rose beds, as was his custom on fine mornings. He had found Mr. Adrian Fenton lying on the stone floor of the pavilion beside the marble table. A revolver lay near his right hand. A folded note rested on the surface of the table, placed with a neatness that seemed, under the circumstances, somehow more disturbing than any disorder could have been. Miss Marple listened to all of this carefully and said very little. She expressed her sorrow and her concern for Dolly, and she agreed, without hesitation, to come to the Hall directly. The walk back along the lime tree drive felt rather different on this second occasion. The morning was still beautiful, the roses still climbing their walls in their accustomed manner, the birds still engaged in their bright, as uncomplicated business in the hedgerows, but Miss Marple walked with her eyes moving gently over the grounds, observing the layout of paths, the visibility from various windows, the distance between the Hall's rear terrace and the pavilion at the garden's far end. She found Dolly in the drawing-room, pale but composed, with a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Inspector Slack had already arrived and was conducting his examination of the pavilion with the brisk efficiency that was his professional manner. One of the young constables from the village stood at the garden entrance with his notebook. Miss Marple accepted the chair Dolly offered and sat quietly for a moment, looking out through the tall windows toward the garden. The pavilion was visible from where she sat, though at some distance its open sides catching the morning light. The ornamental pond beside it lay perfectly still, reflecting the pale sky above. "It seems very clear," Dolly said carefully, as though testing the words. "They are saying, that is, Inspector Slack seems to think, that it was his own hand. There was the note, you see, and the revolver. Everything in its place." Miss Marple said nothing immediately. She looked at the pavilion a moment longer. "Yes," she said at last. "Everything very much in its place." She glanced down at her knitting bag and adjusted its strap across her arm. "People rarely arrange their final moments with quite such tidiness," she remarked softly. "I have known a great deal of human nature in my time, and it is an observation that holds rather more often than one might expect." Dolly looked at her with uncertain eyes. Miss Marple smiled, and gently and without any particular emphasis. "Now," she said, "I think I should very much like a fresh cup of tea, and then, if you would permit it, I should like to walk down to the pavilion myself. One so rarely finds a garden at its best in the morning, and I do not wish to miss it entirely." Chapter 2. A Body Beside the Garden Pavilion. Inspector Slack was a man who had, over the course of his professional life, developed a manner best described as efficiently dissatisfied. He conducted his examinations with the air of someone who has already reached a conclusion, and is proceeding through the formalities chiefly out of obligation to establish procedure. He was not, in Miss Marple's experience, an unkind man, nor was he precisely an unintelligent one, but he possessed a certain briskness of mind that caused him to arrive at the nearest reasonable answer and remain there, like a traveller who, having found an acceptable inn, declines to inquire whether a better one might stand a little further down the road. He was standing at the far end of the garden path when Miss Marple descended the shallow stone steps from the terrace, having finished her second cup of tea, and declined, with gentle firmness, Dolly's suggestion that she remain indoors. The morning had deepened into that particular quality of June light that makes English gardens look as though they have been painted by someone in an exceptionally benevolent mood, and the roses along the south wall were producing their fragrance with an almost immodest generosity. Miss Marple walked at her usual contemplative pace, noting as she went the lay of the path, the position of the various flower beds, and the precise angle from which the rose pavilion first became visible between the yew hedges. It was, she reflected, a rather longer walk than it appeared from the drawing-room window. Long enough, certainly, for a person crossing the garden at night to be heard by anyone who happened to be listening from an upper window. Long enough, also, for a great many things to be accomplished in the time between one person departing and another arriving. Inspector Slack observed her approach with the expression of a man who has learned, through painful experience, that Miss Marple's presence at a scene of inquiry is not a circumstance he has any practical means of preventing, and who has accordingly made his peace with it after a fashion. "Miss Marple," he said by way of acknowledgment. "Good morning, Inspector," she replied pleasantly. "I do hope I am not in the way. I promised Mrs. Bantry I would look at the new rosework they have done to the pavilion columns. She has been so pleased with it, and one feels it would be unkind not to admire it properly." Inspector Slack looked briefly at the pavilion columns and then back at Miss Marple, with an expression that suggested he found this explanation imperfectly convincing. He was, however, a realist in such matters. "We've finished the main examination," he said. "Dr. Hayward's had his look. The body has been. That is, Mr. Fenton has been attended to. There's not much to detain you, I shouldn't think." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "I don't suppose there is." She moved past him with a small, polite nod and stepped into the pavilion. It was a pleasant structure in the morning light, its climbing roses performing their decorative duty with admirable conscientiousness, their pale pink blooms nodding gently in what little breeze there was. The marble table occupied the centre as she remembered it from her earlier visit, white and cool and slightly formal, the sort of table that suggested letter-writing and afternoon correspondence, rather than anything more serious. The cane chairs stood in their positions nearby, light and impermanent looking against the stone floor. On the far side the ornamental pond lay perfectly still, its surface catching the sky. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment and looked at the scene with the unhurried attention she brought to most things. The stone floor near the table had been examined, she could see, by the marks left in the fine summer dust that had settled there. Dr. Hayward had apparently been thorough. A slight discoloration near the base of the table's nearest leg might have been anything or nothing. She did not kneel to examine it, which would have been both undignified and unnecessary, but she noted its position relative to the marble edge above it, and stored the observation away in that orderly mental arrangement she maintained for such details. The revolver, she was informed by the young constable who had followed her into the pavilion at a respectful distance, had been removed for examination. It had belonged to the hall, he explained, kept in a locked cabinet in the study. Mr. Bantry had maintained the habit in his time of keeping a small collection of firearms, as country gentlemen of his generation often did, and the current arrangement had simply continued under Mrs. Bantry's administration, largely forgotten and largely undisturbed. Miss Marple considered this information with interest. A revolver from a locked cabinet implied at the very least that someone had known of its existence and had known how to obtain access to it. Mr. Fenton, recently arrived and not a member of the household, might conceivably have discovered it during his extended stay. Then again, he might not have been the one who discovered it. She turned her attention to the marble table. The note had also been removed, but Inspector Slack, with the slightly condescending generosity of a man who does not expect the information to be put to significant use, had described it to her. A brief communication, he had said, in an educated hand, expressing regret for what he called past errors and asking that the matter be dealt with as discreetly as possible. It was the sort of note, Slack had concluded with satisfaction, that one sometimes saw in cases of this nature. Despairing, but controlled. Lucid, but final. "Did it occur to you," Miss Marple had asked mildly, back in the drawing-room before her walk, "that a man intending to end his own life might phrase such a note rather differently? With more personal warmth, perhaps, more grief. Regret for errors has a somewhat administrative quality." Slack had smiled with the tolerant indulgence of a man who finds the observations of elderly ladies charming in their way. "People in extremity don't always write as one might expect, Miss Marple," he had said kindly. Miss Marple had said nothing further on the subject at that point. The other guests had been gathered in the morning-room when she returned to the hall, and seated in that arrangement of careful proximity and careful distance that people adopt when they have spent a night under the same roof as a sudden death, and are uncertain how to position themselves in relation to it. Mrs. Celia Fortescue occupied the armchair nearest the window, her posture perfectly composed, her hands resting in her lap with a stillness that suggested conscious management rather than natural ease. She had changed her dress since the previous afternoon and was wearing something in a soft blue that was equally well chosen. Her expression communicated grief of a measured, socially appropriate kind, and she received Miss Marple's sympathetic inquiry with a gentle inclination of the head. "One does one's best to remain steady," she said, in a tone that balanced sorrow with what she clearly felt was commendable fortitude. "Poor Mr. Fenton. I confess I had noticed in recent days that he seemed somewhat burdened. These things are of course so terribly difficult to interpret at the time. Had he seemed troubled to you specifically?" Miss Marple asked, with the gentle curiosity of a person making polite conversation. "In a general way," Mrs. Fortescue replied. "He had financial anxieties, I believe. Mr. Arden would know more about that than I." Mr. Philip Arden was standing near the fireplace with a cup of coffee that he did not appear to be drinking. He was, if anything, rather paler than Miss Marple remembered him from the previous afternoon, and his careful manner had acquired a slight additional rigidity, as though he were holding himself at a particular angle by an act of will. He confirmed, when asked, that Fenton had been concerned about certain investment matters. There had been, he said, selecting his words with professional precision, some complications in property transactions with which Fenton had been involved before his arrival in the country. Nothing unusual in that, in these uncertain times. Men of business frequently carried such burdens. "He did not confide the details to you?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not specifically," Arden said. There was a brief pause. "We spoke in general terms." Miss Judith Marlowe was seated on the window-seat with a book closed in her lap that she had evidently not been reading. She had, of the four guests, the most natural manner, which is perhaps to say that she appeared to be experiencing something more closely resembling genuine shock than the composed arrangements of expression visible in the others. Her bright eyes were rather subdued this morning, and she answered Miss Marple's quiet inquiry with a directness that suggested she saw no particular reason for evasion. She had spoken with Fenton the previous evening, she said. Fairly late, perhaps 10:30. They had met by accident on the garden terrace when she'd stepped out for a few minutes of air before retiring, and he had been there already, standing at the balustrade and looking down toward the garden, They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes. He had seemed, she said, perfectly calm. Not happy precisely, but calm. He had asked her about her research. He had listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, and had said good night in the manner of a man who intends to do precisely that. He did not seem, Miss Marple asked carefully, like a man who had made any irreversible decision. Miss Marlowe shook her head without hesitation. Quite the opposite. He spoke about an appointment he meant to keep later in the week, in London. Inspector Slack, to whom this same information had apparently been offered, had noted it, and concluded that men in certain mental states frequently make plans they have no intention of keeping, as a way of maintaining the appearance of normality. This was, Miss Marple acknowledged privately, not an unreasonable observation. But it was, she felt, the sort of observation that one makes when one already has an answer, and is looking for ways to accommodate inconvenient details rather than to learn from them. She took her leave of the morning-room guests with a few kind words, and made her way back through the long corridor that connected the east wing to the main hall, pausing at the window that overlooked the south garden. From here, as she had suspected, the pavilion was clearly visible. The pond beside it caught the morning light along its nearer edge. The cane chairs were just distinguishable from this distance, pale shapes within the open structure. She stood there for a little while, thinking about nothing in particular, which was generally when she found she thought most clearly. A garden chair facing directly toward the pond rather than toward the roses, and it was a small thing, and most people would say it meant nothing at all. People sat where they happened to sit. They turned chairs in whatever direction suited the moment. But Miss Marple had spent a considerable portion of her life observing what people do in moments of perfect freedom, when no one is watching, when there is no reason to arrange oneself for effect, and in those moments, in her experience, people sat facing the things they loved. She turned from the window and went to find Dolly Bantry. "My dear," she said, when she found her in the small sitting-room off the kitchen, occupied with nothing in particular and looking rather lost. "I wonder if you would mind telling me who, besides yourself, knows where the key to the firearms cabinet is kept?" Dolly blinked. "Why, it's on the ring in the study." "Anyone who knew to look, really." "It is not," she added, with a trace of the apology that comes from recognising an oversight after the fact. "Especially well concealed." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I rather thought it might not be." She accepted the chair Dolly offered and settled into it, and the two old friends sat together for a while in the quiet of the morning and did not say anything further about it, which was, under the circumstances, quite the most comfortable arrangement. Chapter 3. A folded note on the marble table. There is a particular quality to the middle hours of a June morning that encourages reflection. The urgency of early rising has passed, the demands of luncheon have not yet asserted themselves, and the world sits briefly in a kind of golden suspension, neither hurrying forward nor looking back. In the gardens of Gossington Hall, bees moved between the roses with purposeful contentment, and a wood-pigeon somewhere in the lime trees repeated its soft, unhurried observation to no one in particular. Miss Marple sat in the small sitting-room off the kitchen with a cup of tea that had cooled to exactly the temperature she preferred, and thought, with some care, about folded paper. Inspector Slack had been good enough in his expansive way to allow her a brief examination of the note before it was taken away for further consideration by those whose professional responsibility such things were. He had held it toward her with the air of a man showing a child something mildly interesting, but essentially simple, and Miss Marple had looked at it for rather longer than he had anticipated, which had caused him a degree of barely concealed impatience. The handwriting was, as Slack had described it, educated and even. The letters were formed with the regularity of a person who had been properly schooled, and who wrote with some frequency, neither the cramped script of someone who rarely puts pen to paper, nor the fluid ease of a person for whom writing is a daily pleasure. It was, in short, the hand of a man conducting a piece of business correspondence. The content had been brief. 3 sentences or perhaps 4, an acknowledgement of certain unspecified errors, a request for discretion in their management, a closing that offered neither warmth nor bitterness, only a kind of formal finality, as one might sign off a memorandum. It was the folding that had interested her most. The note had been folded twice, with the precision of someone who had folded a great many letters in their life, and did so without thinking. A single fold was the natural gesture of a person placing a private thought upon a surface. One fold, as if to indicate that the contents were not for immediate public view, but were not deeply hidden either. 2 folds spoke of a different intention. 2 folds said, "This is not meant to be read at once. This is meant to be found, and then, after a moment's pause, deliberately opened." It was the gesture, Miss Marple reflected, of a man placing a letter in an envelope, a man who had written a private communication intended for a specific recipient, not a final declaration laid out for the world to discover beside his body. She set down her teacup and considered this quietly. The morning's interviews had given her a good deal to arrange in her mind. She was fond of arrangement, in the way that a gardener is fond of it, not for the pleasure of tidiness in itself, but because things that are correctly placed reveal their relationships to one another in ways that disorder conceals. She thought about Mr. Philip Arden. He had been, she decided, not so much evasive as compressed. There is a difference, and it is one that Miss Marple had learned to distinguish over a long acquaintance with human self-presentation. The evasive people actively steer away from certain subjects, and in doing so they draw attention to the very ground they are avoiding, like a person who crosses a room in a wide arc around a particular piece of furniture. Compressed people, on the other hand, simply reduce themselves. They speak in shorter sentences. They choose the more general word when a specific one would do. They answer the question that was asked and volunteer nothing beyond it. Mr. Arden had been doing precisely that when he spoke about Fenton's financial troubles, and Miss Marple had found his compression rather more informative than an elaborate account would have been. He had admitted, with the careful economy of the genuinely careful, that Fenton had been troubled about investment matters. He had confirmed that they had spoken in general terms, and he had not said, and this omission was, to Miss Marple's ear, the most eloquent thing about the exchange, that he had been unable to help. A financial adviser who could not assist a man troubled by financial matters would naturally say so. The fact that Arden had not said so suggested either that he had assisted, or that the nature of the trouble was of a kind that made assistance from that particular quarter impossible. She was still considering this when there was a quiet knock at the sitting-room door and Miss Judith Marlowe appeared, looking slightly tentative, with the expression of someone who has decided to do something and is mildly apprehensive about having decided it. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she said. "Mrs. Bantry mentioned you were in here, and I wondered— that is, there is something I have been thinking about, and I am not entirely certain whether I ought to mention it to Inspector Slack." "Then perhaps," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "you might mention it to me first, and we can consider together whether it seems the kind of thing that would be useful to the inspector." Miss Marlowe came in and took the chair across from her, with the directness of a young woman who, having resolved upon a course, sees no profit in approaching it sideways. She had, Miss Marple noted, changed her manner slightly since the morning-room interview. The subdued quality was still present, but it had been joined by something more purposeful. "When I spoke with Mr. Fenton last evening," she began, "on the terrace, I told Inspector Slack that our conversation was perfectly ordinary, and that is largely true. We talked about my research, about the parish records, about the history of the Hall. But there was one moment, toward the end, when we'd been standing there perhaps quarter of an hour, when he said something that I have been turning over in my mind ever since." She paused, arranging her recollection with evident care. "He said that he had come to Gossington Hall with certain intentions that had not been straightforward, and that he had found himself rather less comfortable with those intentions than he had expected. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't press him, because it seemed the sort of remark a person makes almost to themselves rather than to their actual listener. Then he seemed to recollect where he was, and he changed the subject quite smoothly. And we spoke about something else entirely until we said good night. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. He used the phrase, "not straightforward," she said. "Those particular words?" "Yes. I noticed them because they struck me as an unusual choice. Most people would say dishonest or complicated or not quite right. Not straightforward has a rather more technical quality, I thought, as though he were describing a procedure." Miss Marple looked at her with warm appreciation. "You have a very good ear, my dear," she said. Miss Marlowe coloured slightly and said that she supposed writing did train one to attend to the specific weight of words. "Did he seem," Miss Marple asked after a moment, "like a man who'd concluded that he wished to extricate himself from whatever these not straightforward intentions involved? Or like a man still in the midst of them?" Miss Marlowe considered this with genuine seriousness. "Neither exactly. He seemed resolved, but I could not have said, even at the time, what he had resolved upon." After Miss Marlowe had thanked her and gone, Miss Marple sat for a little while longer and thought about resolved men and the various directions in which resolution can lead a person. It was shortly before noon when Inspector Slack appeared at the sitting-room door with the slightly reduced energy of a man who has been very brisk all morning and is beginning to feel it. He had, he said, completed his examination of the note to his satisfaction, and Dr. Hayward had confirmed his findings. The handwriting had been verified by comparison with a letter found among Fenton's possessions in his room. The firearms cabinet had indeed been unlocked, which was, Slack observed with the mild severity of a man who finds such oversights professionally irritating, a rather careless domestic arrangement, and the revolver was confirmed as one of the pieces from the cabinet's small collection. Everything, he said, with the tone of a man tidying a desk, was consistent. "The fold of the note," Miss Marple said gently. "Did it seem to you a natural gesture for a man leaving a final message?" Slack looked at her with the expression he reserved for observations he intended to be tolerant about. "People fold notes in all sorts of ways, Miss Marple." "Indeed they do," she agreed. "One folds a note differently depending on what one intends it for. A note laid on a surface for someone to find is generally folded once, I think you will find, only if you reflect upon it. Two folds suggest a letter intended for an envelope, as though the writer had been composing a correspondence and had simply stopped at a certain point before the addressing." Slack regarded her steadily. He didn't say that this was an interesting distinction, because he was a man who found it difficult to concede interesting distinctions to elderly ladies in sitting rooms. But something in his expression shifted very slightly, in the manner of a door that has not been opened but has been tested and found less firmly shut than previously supposed. "I'll bear it in mind," he said, which was, from Inspector Slack, a concession of some significance. After he had gone, Miss Marple rose and went to the window. The garden lay before her in its full June splendour, and the pavilion was just visible in the distance between the yew hedges, its climbing roses bright in the noon light. She thought about a man who wrote with the precision of professional habit. She thought about a note folded twice, as for an envelope that had never been sealed. She thought about resolved intentions and not straightforward procedures, and the particular compressed manner of a financial adviser who had answered every question accurately without once saying anything that was fully true. Mrs. Fortescue remarked that troubled men often hide their feelings, she recalled. It had been a perfectly reasonable observation, offered at exactly the right moment. Almost, she thought, as though it had been prepared. Calmness and despair, Miss Marple reflected, studying the still surface of the distant pond, did not, in her experience, arrange themselves together quite so obligingly as the present circumstances seemed to require. Chapter 4. Ash from a Burned Envelope. Luncheon at Gossington Hall that day was a subdued affair, as luncheons in houses where something unfortunate has occurred tend to be. The food was perfectly good. Mrs. Bantry's cook, a solid and dependable woman named Mrs. Rudge, held the view that proper meals were among the more reliable forms of human comfort, and she had produced a cold collation of considerable quality. but the conversation moved with the careful deliberateness of people selecting their words from a range in which several perfectly natural subjects have, for the time being, been made unavailable. Mrs. Fortescue spoke about her garden in Hampshire, with an enthusiasm that might, in other circumstances, have been charming. Mr. Arden contributed a few remarks about the summer weather, in a tone suggesting he found meteorology a safe if uninspiring topic. Miss Marlowe ate quietly and said little, with the absorbed expression of someone arranging their thoughts. Dolly Bantry, who was not by nature a subdued person, made 2 or 3 attempts at her customary warmth, and then subsided into a kind of affectionate helplessness, passing the bread with the automatic generosity of a woman who, when uncertain what else to offer, offers something edible. Miss Marple ate with quiet appreciation, and observed everyone with the benign attentiveness of a person whose interest in her companions is entirely genuine and entirely without agenda, which was, in one sense, perfectly true. It was during the clearing of the first course that Thomas, the senior gardener, appeared at the door of the dining room with his hat in his hands and the slightly martyred expression of a man who has been told to report something, and is not entirely certain the reporting will be well received. He had found something, he said, addressing himself primarily to Mrs. Bantry, who was his employer and therefore his natural audience, near the marble table. He had not noticed it earlier in the morning, on account of the business and the people coming and going and the inspector's men moving about. But when he had gone back to the pavilion after the police had finished to see what state the place was in, he had noticed a small patch of ash on the stone floor, just to the side of where the table leg met the paving. Dolly looked at him with the expression she wore when presented with household information she does not immediately know how to classify. "Ash," she repeated, "as from a letter, ma'am, or something of that sort. Burned there, I should think. Not blown in, because the edges of it were quite sharp and the pile was tidy, not scattered. And there was no wind to speak of last evening." He was thanked, reassured that he had done exactly right in mentioning it, and sent back to his rose beds with the slightly improved demeanour of a man whose duty has been satisfactorily discharged. Miss Marple, who had been attending to her cold salmon with every appearance of undivided concentration, said nothing at all. It was not until after luncheon, when the guests had dispersed to their various afternoon arrangements, and Dolly had gone to speak with Mrs. Rudge about the evening meal, that Miss Marple put on her cardigan and made her way back down to the pavilion. The ash was precisely as Thomas had described it. A small, neat deposit on the stone floor close against the base of the marble table's nearest leg, its edges fairly clean, its colour the pale grey of paper recently burned rather than the darker residue of wood or cloth. She did not disturb it. She stood over it for a moment, studying its position relative to the table above and the open sides of the pavilion around it. Thomas had been quite right about the wind. She had noticed herself, the previous evening when she had walked home from her tea visit, that the air was peculiarly still. The ash had not drifted. It had fallen directly downward from the point at which the burning had occurred, and the burning had occurred approximately above and slightly to the left of where she was standing, which placed it. She raised her eyes to the table's surface, almost precisely where the revolver had reportedly rested. Someone had stood at the marble table in the pavilion on a still evening, and had burned a letter or document there, holding it until the flames required them to release it, and allowing the ash to fall straight down onto the stone floor. It was not the action of a person burning something in a fireplace or a garden incinerator. It was the action of a person who wished the destruction to be immediate and complete, and who was, for reasons of their own, conducting it in this particular location. Miss Marple straightened and looked out through the pavilion's open side toward the pond. The question she turned over most carefully was not who had burned the letter, for she had already formed a tentative view on that matter. The more interesting question was what the letter had contained, and why its destruction, at that particular time and in that particular place, had been considered necessary. Mr. Philip Arden had confirmed, when asked during the morning, that Fenton had received a letter delivered to the Hall that afternoon. He had been specific about the afternoon, and slightly less specific about everything else, including whether he'd been present when it was delivered, who had brought it, and what he himself had observed of Fenton's response to receiving it. These omissions had been accomplished with the smooth efficiency of a man who has decided in advance which portions of a narrative he is prepared to share. She found him in the mid-afternoon in the library, which was a comfortable room at the hall's quieter end, lined with the sort of books that have been inherited rather than chosen, and are the better for it. He was standing at the window when she entered and turned with the contained alertness of a man who has been doing rather less reading than his surroundings suggested. "Mr. Arden," she said pleasantly, settling herself into one of the library's agreeable armchairs, with the ease of a person who has been settling into armchairs for a great many decades and has become rather accomplished at it. "I wonder if I might ask you something about the letter, mister. Fenton received yesterday afternoon." Arden regarded her with the careful neutrality he had been maintaining all day. He was, she had decided, a man of genuine intelligence, which made him, in some respects, more interesting, and in others, considerably more cautious. "I'm not certain I can tell you much more than I've already told the inspector," he said. "I am sure you told the inspector everything that seemed relevant," Miss Marple agreed warmly, which was a slightly different statement, and which Arden received with a brief contraction of something around his eyes that suggested he had noticed the difference. "The letter arrived in the afternoon post," he said. "I happened to be in the hall when Thomas brought it in. It was addressed to Fenton by hand. I had no reason to take particular notice of it." "But you did take particular notice of it," Miss Marple observed, with gentle precision. "Otherwise you would not have remembered its arrival so clearly, or that it was handwritten rather than typed." A pause. Outside, a blackbird moved through the rose border with its quick, certain step. "The handwriting was distinctive," Arden said. "I recognised it." "Ah," said Miss Marple, in the tone of a person receiving information they had suspected was available. "And whose handwriting was it?" Another pause, longer than the first. Mr. Arden looked out of the window with an expression that was not evasive, but rather the look of a man weighing something that has been pressing on him and assessing whether the weight has become greater than the reasons for bearing it. It was Mrs. Fortescue's, he said at last. "I have seen her write on several occasions. She has a very particular way of forming capital letters." Miss Marple received this in silence, with the air of someone who has been told a thing they already half knew, and who is now considering what it confirms rather than what it reveals. "And you said nothing of this to Inspector Slack," she observed, without any particular emphasis. "I was not certain it was relevant," he said. "People correspond. There may have been a perfectly ordinary reason for the letter." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "there may have been." She looked at the fireplace, which was unlit and filled with a small arrangement of dried flowers in the summer manner. "The ash in the pavilion," she said, more to herself than to him. "From a burned document, Thomas thinks. Paper. Why, the look of it. A letter, perhaps." She did not look at Arden as she said this, which was, she had found, often more instructive than looking at people directly. In her peripheral vision she observed a stillness that had a different quality from the stillness he had been maintaining all morning. It was the stillness of a person absorbing something rather than managing something. "I didn't know about the ash," he said, and the compression in his voice had eased, very slightly, in the manner of a coiled thing releasing a fraction of its tension. "No," she said. "I thought perhaps you did not." She rose from the armchair with the deliberate care she applied to such manoeuvres, gathered her cardigan about her and moved toward the door. "It is a curious thing," she said, pausing at the threshold, that a person who wished to destroy a letter might choose to burn it in the very place where it would subsequently be found, rather than in a fireplace indoors, or in the kitchen range, or anywhere else that would have left no trace and raised no questions. It suggests, I think, that the burning was somewhat hurried, or that the person doing it was not quite thinking as clearly as they usually do. She smiled at Mr. Arden with the warm, slightly absent expression she sometimes employed when her thoughts were engaged elsewhere. "Thank you so much for your company," she said. "I do find libraries so conducive to reflection, don't you?" And she left him there by the window. With the afternoon light falling across the inherited books and the unlit hearth, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a room in which something has been, at last, very nearly said. Chapter 5. Cane Chair Facing the Pond. The afternoon settled over Gossington Hall with the unhurried authority of a June day that knows it has time to spare. Shadows lengthened across the lawn by degrees too gradual to observe directly, and the roses along the south wall moved in occasional slow arcs as the faintest suggestion of a breeze passed through them, insufficient to stir anything heavier, but enough to make itself known to the flowers. A thrush had established itself in the copper beech at the garden's eastern boundary, and was rehearsing a phrase of considerable complexity with the patient persistence of a musician who believes repetition to be its own reward. Miss Marple had returned to the pavilion. She had not announced this intention to anyone in particular. After her conversation with Mr. Arden in the library, she had walked back through the long corridor, paused to collect her knitting bag from the sitting-room, exchanged a brief and affectionate word with Dolly about the proper care of climbing roses on north-facing walls, and made her way down through the garden at the unhurried pace of a woman with a purely botanical purpose. If anyone observed her from the upper windows of the hall, they would have seen only a small, white-haired figure moving along the herbaceous border with the attentive deliberateness of an elderly lady who takes her horticulture seriously. The pavilion, when she reached it, was empty and quiet. The police had completed their work for the day, and the place had resumed something of its ordinary character, though it held, as such places tend to after distressing events, a quality of careful stillness, as if it were aware that something had occurred, and was not yet certain whether it had returned to being merely a garden structure, or remained, for the time being, something more significant. Miss Marple stood just inside the open side that faced the rose beds and looked at the cane chair. It stood, as it had stood when she had first observed it that morning, facing the pond. From where she positioned herself she could see both the chair and, by turning her head, the ornamental pond beyond the pavilion's far edge, its surface carrying the afternoon sky in a pale and slightly luminous reflection. The chair was of the old-fashioned sort, with a wide curved back and arms that flared gently outward, perfectly designed for sitting and contemplating at leisure. It was the kind of chair, she thought, that had spent most of its existence facing the rose-beds, because the rose-beds were what the pavilion had been built to appreciate, and because whoever arranged such things at Gossington Hall had placed it accordingly for a good many years. Thomas had been quite clear on this point. He had maintained the pavilion and its furnishings for 11 years, he had told her, and the chair had always, in his experience, been set to face the roses. It was where you sat if you wanted to look at the garden. The pond was a pleasant enough feature, but it was a secondary feature, and no one in his memory had particularly wanted to sit with their back to the roses in order to contemplate a rectangular stretch of still water. She settled herself into the chair carefully to test the view. From this position, but the pond occupied the foreground of her vision. It was not an unpleasant prospect. The water caught the light agreeably, and there were a few flag irises at the near edge in the last of their flowering. Their purple heads reflected downward into the water with a certain dignity. But the roses were behind her. Their fragrance reached her quite clearly, which made it rather more pointed that a person sitting here would not see them at all. She turned her attention to the upstairs windows of the hall, visible across the garden from where she sat. 3 windows looked directly down toward the pavilion from the upper floor. The centre one, she believed, belonged to the corridor that connected the guest rooms. The left-hand one was, if she remembered Dolly's brief tour of the house correctly, the room occupied by Mrs. Fortescue. The right-hand one she had not been able to place with certainty. A person seated in this chair, facing the pond, would have their back to the rose-beds, but their face and figure visible from those upstairs windows. If someone had arranged the chair in this position deliberately, they had created a scene that could be observed from above, a figure seated alone in the pavilion facing the water on a summer evening. It was, she reflected, a composition, something arranged for a particular effect, like a tableau in a theatre. She rose from the chair and walked around the pavilion's perimeter, noting the sight lines from various angles. From the garden path that curved around from the hall's rear terrace, the pavilion was visible, but its interior was not. The yew hedge on the path's left side occluded a direct view, until one was within approximately 15 feet of the structure. A person walking down that path would not see who was seated inside the pavilion until they were quite close. From the upstairs windows, however, the view was unobstructed. The angle was steep, but it looked directly into the pavilion's open face. A rather theatrical arrangement, she observed aloud, to the thrush in the copper beech, and no one else in particular. The thrush continued its rehearsal, unimpressed. She was standing at the pond's edge, looking back at the pavilion and considering this geometry, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to find Dolly Bantry approaching with 2 cups of tea on a small tray, Nis moving with the slightly determined air of a woman who has decided that fresh air and tea are the appropriate prescription for the afternoon. "I thought you might want company," Dolly said, in the tone she used when she meant something slightly different, which in this case was closer to, "I needed to come outside and I thought you might be here." They sat together in the pavilion's cane chairs, both now facing the roses as Miss Marple had quietly repositioned them, and drank their tea with the comfortable silence of long friendship. "Thomas," Miss Marple said eventually, "you said has been with the Hall for 11 years. "Nearly 12, Dolly confirmed. "Came just before Arthur's last illness. Terribly reliable man. Knows exactly where everything should be, which is more than I can say for most people. And he is quite certain the chair was moved. He mentioned it to me this morning before the inspector arrived, actually. He came to find me first, you know, when he found Mr. Fenton. And one of the first things he said, after the main of it, was that someone had been at the furniture. He keeps things very particularly." Miss Marple nodded and drank her tea. "Dolly," she said, after a pleasant pause, "how long has Mrs. Fortescue been in the habit of visiting Gossington Hall?" Dolly considered this with the slightly compressed expression she wore when thinking about something she would have preferred not to think about. She was, as Miss Marple knew, a fundamentally open-hearted person, which meant that doubts about people she was supposed to be fond of caused her a particular discomfort. "She came first, 3 years ago, I think. She wrote to me. I had not seen her since Arthur's time, we were never especially close, and said she was touring the district and wondered if she might call. I said yes, of course, because one does, and she came for a week and was perfectly agreeable, and then she went away and wrote a very nice letter, and then she came again the following year," a pause, "and the year after." "She is familiar with the Hall's arrangements then," Miss Marple said. "The rooms, the outbuildings, the study, the various cabinetry." Dolly looked at her over the rim of her teacup with the expression of a woman who has just heard something slightly alarming expressed in the most comfortable possible language. "I suppose she is," she said slowly. "And she and Mr. Fenton, so far as you observed, their acquaintance was formed here, at the Hall, during this visit?" "That is what I assumed." Another pause. "Though now that you ask it in that way, I find I'm not certain I ever actually asked either of them. They seem to know each other's names from the first morning at breakfast. But that might simply be the way with house parties, mightn't it? One is introduced, and one uses names." "One is introduced," Miss Marple agreed. "Yes." She set down her cup and looked out at the rose beds, which were performing magnificently in the afternoon light, their various pinks and creams and whites arranged with the unconsidered artistry of things that have been growing in the same spot for a sufficient number of years to know exactly what they are doing. It was, she thought, a question worth examining, whether two people who appear to have met for the first time in a country house have in fact never encountered each other before. In her experience, people who genuinely meet for the first time make a certain class of small errors in each other's presence, errors of name, of preference, of history, that are entirely absent in people who are already acquainted. She'd observed no such errors between Fenton and Mrs. Fortescue in the previous afternoon's brief introductions, Then they had moved around each other with the unconscious fluency of people who already know how the other moves. "Dolly," she said presently, "have you a guest book? The sort in which visitors record themselves?" Dolly brightened, because this was the sort of practical question she could address with confidence. "Indeed I have. Arthur started it years ago, and I have kept it going. It is on the writing desk in the morning room." "I wonder," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "whether we might look at it after tea. I'm always so interested in where people have been." Dolly said that of course they might, and poured the last of the tea with a slightly more purposeful air than she had brought to the pouring of the first cup. The guest book, as it transpired, was a handsome thing, bound in dark green leather and filled with the accumulated handwriting of a decade's visitors in all its variety. It took Miss Marple perhaps 4 minutes of unhurried examination to find what she had half expected to find. Mrs. Celia Fortescue had signed the Hall's guest book on 3 previous occasions, as Dolly had said. Mr. Adrian Fenton had signed it twice, once in the previous autumn when he had visited for 3 days, and once 2 years before that during the same week as Mrs. Fortescue's second visit. She closed the book gently and returned it to its place on the writing desk. "Such a lovely record," she said warmly. "You must be so pleased to have kept it up all these years." And Dolly, who was looking at the book with rather a different expression than she had worn when she retrieved it, agreed that yes. She supposed she must. Chapter 6. Keys found in the gravel path. Evening came to Gossington Hall in its gradual generous way, the sky deepening through a succession of soft colours above the lime trees, the garden releasing the warmth it had been holding all day in slow, fragrant increments. By 7 o'clock the roses had taken on that particular quality of late light that makes pink flowers appear to produce their own illumination, and the pond at the garden's far end lay in a stillness so complete it might have been painted there. Miss Marple had been given, at Dolly's insistence, and with her own private satisfaction, the small guest room on the first floor that looked out over the south garden. It was a room she had occupied on previous visits, and she was fond of it in the way one becomes fond of rooms that have consistently offered comfort without pretension. The curtains were of a faded rose chintz, the writing table beside the window was of exactly the right height, and the view across the garden, particularly in the evening, was one of the more calming prospects she knew. She stood at this window now, in the hour before dinner, and looked out. The pavilion was visible, as it always was from this position, its pale stone catching the last of the light. The pond beside it had gone from silver to a deep, quiet grey. Thomas had been at the rose-beds until 6:30, a small, unhurried figure moving with the habitual certainty of a man who knows every inch of ground he tends, and had then gathered his things and gone in the direction of the tool shed with the measured tread of someone whose day's work is complete and who is satisfied with it. It was a peaceful scene. It was, Miss Marple thought, very nearly too peaceful, in the way that certain pieces of music are very nearly too smooth, their surfaces so carefully maintained that one cannot help wondering what lies beneath. She had been thinking about the guest book. The fact of Fenton and Mrs. Fortescue's shared previous visit, 2 years prior, 3 days together at the Hall, was not, in itself, conclusive of anything. People who move in overlapping social circles frequently find themselves at the same houses without there being any more to it than coincidence of acquaintance. But Miss Marple had been observing people's behaviour toward one another for a very long time, and she had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between the natural ease of people who have met before, and are pleased to acknowledge it, and the somewhat more careful ease of people who have met before and have decided, for their own reasons, not to acknowledge it. Fenton and Mrs. Fortescue had been doing the latter. She was now quite confident of it. The question that followed from this was a natural one. What had passed between them 2 years ago and in the time since, that made their shared history something to be managed rather than mentioned? She was still at the window, considering this, when she heard raised voices from below. They were not dramatically raised. This was not the sort of household in which doors were slammed and accusations hurled. But there was an elevation in the tone coming from the direction of the morning room that was, in the context of Gossington Hall's customary register quite conspicuous. She could not make out the words, only the shapes of them. A woman's voice, measured but strained, and a man's voice, shorter in its phrases, with the clipped quality of someone maintaining control under some pressure. The voices ceased within a minute or two. A door opened and closed. Footsteps moved along the corridor below with a deliberate, unhurried tread. Miss Marple turned from the window and went down to dinner. The dining room had been arranged with Dolly's usual warm hospitality, and candles on the table and the good china that came out for guests, and Mrs. Rudge had produced a soup of great authority and a roast that made the room smell of rosemary and comfort. The conversation was, if anything, slightly more animated than it had been at luncheon, in the way that conversation sometimes becomes after a period of suppression, the various participants making a collective and largely unconscious decision that life must proceed. Mrs. Fortescue was in particularly good form. She spoke fluently about gardens she had visited, about a concert she had attended in London the previous month, about the particular pleasure of country evenings in June. Her colour was, if anything, slightly heightened, and her composure had the bright, polished quality of something that has been recently attended to. She directed a good deal of this brightness toward Miss Marple, with the instinct, which Miss Marple had observed in other people and always found interesting, of a person who has decided that a potential difficulty is best managed through the application of charm. Miss Marple received it all with warm appreciation and contributed several pleasant observations of her own about gardens and concerts and summer evenings, and said nothing whatsoever about the guest book or burned correspondence or the specific geometry of cane chairs. It was after dinner, when the party had moved to the drawing-room and Dolly was dispensing coffee, that Inspector Slack arrived. He came in with the purposeful air of a man who has spent the day accumulating information, and has now arrived at the point of deploying it. And he declined coffee with the abstracted efficiency of someone whose mind is already engaged elsewhere. He had, he said, a few further questions if the company would bear with him, and a small matter he wished to raise. The small matter was a set of keys. He produced them from his jacket pocket with the slightly theatrical timing of a man who is not without a sense of occasion. A small ring bearing 3 keys of modest size, the sort used for interior locks rather than the main doors of a house. Mrs. Fortescue looked at them, and then looked at Inspector Slack with an expression of polite puzzlement. "Why, those are mine," she said, with the composed surprise of a woman identifying a mislaid glove. "I have been wondering where I had put them." "Found in the gravel path," Slack said, with a precision that was almost ceremonial. "The path leading from the rear terrace down toward the pavilion, just below the second yew hedge." "How very curious," Mrs. Fortescue said. "I must have dropped them during my evening walk." She received the keys from him with a slight, gracious inclination of the head. "I do often walk in the garden after dinner. The night air is so restorative." "Quite late, I understand," Slack said. "Miss Marlowe mentioned seeing you near the pavilion area when she came out onto the terrace at approximately 10:30. "I am not in the habit of consulting a clock during an evening stroll," Mrs. Fortescue said pleasantly. "But yes, I was out for some time. It was such a lovely evening." Miss Marlowe, seated on the settee near the window, said nothing, but she was attending to this exchange with a concentrated quality of attention that Miss Marple, seated adjacent to her, could feel without needing to observe directly. "And you went as far as the pavilion itself?" Slack asked. "I may have walked that way," Mrs. Fortescue said. "The path is a natural circuit." "The path being rather dark by that hour," Slack continued, with the persistence of a man who has decided to push forward whether or not the ground is perfectly level. "One wonders how you managed the walk without your keys in your pocket. Or indeed, why you would have needed keys for an evening stroll at all." A brief silence, which Mrs. Fortescue managed with notable composure. "I keep them habitually about me," she said. "One does when staying in a house. Habit." Miss Marple, who had been examining the pattern on the coffee cup with an absorbed interest that would have deceived no one who knew her, looked up at this point and addressed Mrs. Fortescue with a pleasantly conversational air. "I find the same," she said warmly. "One always carries the keys one is most accustomed to. I carry the key to my garden gate at home, quite without thinking, wherever I go. It is a remarkably small key and terribly impractical here in Berkshire, but there it is." She smiled. "What do your keys open, if I may ask? I always find these small domestic details so interesting." Mrs. Fortescue looked at her for a fraction of a second with an expression that was almost entirely composed, but contained, at its very edges, something that was not quite as effortless as the rest of her. "A writing desk," she said. "A correspondence box, a small cabinet." "Of course," said Miss Marple, nodding with complete understanding. "The things one always wants secured." Inspector Slack, who had been observing this small exchange with the slightly helpless expression he frequently wore during Miss Marple's conversational manoeuvres, cleared his throat and moved on to his remaining questions, which concerned the timing of various movements on the previous evening, and produced answers from all parties that were correct, consistent, and of limited illumination. After he had gone, the party dispersed to bed with the mutual consent of people who have had a long and effortful day, and find they have no more of themselves to offer the evening. Miss Marple climbed the stairs at her deliberate pace, and returned to her rose-chintz room, always where she sat at the writing table by the window for a little while with her hands folded in the dark garden below her. The keys were the sort used for interior locks: a writing desk, a correspondence box, a small cabinet. She thought about the firearms cabinet in the study, which Dolly had confirmed was secured by one of the keys on the ring that hung in the study itself. She thought about the size of the keys she had seen in Slack's hand: modest, interior keys, precisely the sort that fit small domestic locks. She thought about a woman who habitually carried keys that opened things within the houses she visited, and who, on a still summer evening, had dropped those keys on the gravel path that led to the pavilion. She thought about a person who plans things very carefully and then, in some sudden disruption of those careful plans, is required to act rather faster than intended. Outside, the garden was perfectly quiet. The roses were invisible in the darkness but present in the air, their fragrance unchanged by the hour, patient and indifferent and entirely reliable. Miss Marple reflected that keys, like most things, were less interesting for what they locked than for what they revealed about the person who kept them. Chapter 7. A Guest Who Stayed Too Long. Miss Marple slept well, as she generally did, and woke to the second morning at Gossington Hall with the quiet satisfaction of a person whose mind has been productively occupied during the hours of darkness, working through the various threads of a problem with the unhurried thoroughness that conscious reasoning sometimes fails to achieve. She lay for a few minutes in the rose-chintz room listening to the birds in the lime trees and the distant sound of Thomas beginning his morning rounds, and she arranged what she knew against what she had observed, and found that the arrangement was becoming considerably cleaner than it had been the previous evening. Dolly had laid on breakfast with her customary generosity. There were eggs and bacon and toast and a pot of marmalade of the dark, your serious kind that suggests someone has attended to its making with genuine conviction, and the morning room was full of early light and the smell of good coffee. Miss Marple ate with appreciation, and observed, over the rim of her cup, the various arrivals and departures of the other guests. Mr. Arden came down first, collected his breakfast with the economy of a man who regards the meal as fuel rather than occasion, and settled in the corner chair with a newspaper which he held before him, in the manner of a person who wishes to appear to be reading. He turned a page after approximately 7 minutes, which was, Miss Marple thought, somewhat more rapidly than the density of the financial columns he appeared to be studying would naturally warrant. Mrs. Fortescue arrived at 8:30, composed and well-dressed in a manner that suggested she had applied considerable thought to both before descending. She greeted everyone pleasantly, admired the marmalade, and asked Dolly about the history of the East Garden Wall with the attentive appreciation of a woman who has decided that cultural interest is the most agreeable register in which to conduct the morning. Miss Marlowe did not come down at all for some time, and when she did appear, shortly before 9, She had the look of someone who has spent a portion of the night thinking and has not entirely finished. It was after breakfast, when Mrs. Fortescue had gone upstairs and Arden had retreated once more to the library, and Dolly was engaged with Mrs. Rudge in the kitchen, that Miss Marlowe appeared at the morning-room door and asked with quiet directness whether Miss Marple might have a few minutes. They walked together along the garden terrace, which was warm already in the morning sun, and smelled of the lavender that grew in the raised bed along its southern edge. Miss Marlowe walked with her hands in the pockets of her cardigan and her eyes on the middle distance, and Miss Marple walked beside her with the patient and unpressured air of a person who has all the time that is required. "I have been thinking," Miss Marlowe said at last, "about what you asked me yesterday, whether Mr. Fenton seemed like a man who had resolved something." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I said he seemed resolved, but that I could not say what he had resolved upon. I have been turning that over, and I think I was not being quite precise enough." She paused. "He seemed, I think, like a man who had decided to do something specific and definite, and who had accepted the cost of doing it. There is a particular quality to that kind of decision. One sees it sometimes in people who are about to say something very difficult to someone they are involved with. Not despair, rather the opposite. A kind of arrival." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "That is very precisely observed. The reason I wanted to say it more clearly is that it seems to me inconsistent with the other thing." Miss Marlowe hesitated, then continued with the firmness of someone who has decided to go through rather than around. "A man who has that quality about him, that sense of having arrived at something, of being prepared to act, does not, it seems to me, go quietly to a garden pavilion in the dark and end the matter in that other way. It seems precisely the opposite of what such a person would do." "It does," Miss Marple agreed simply. They walked a little further in silence. "I did not say this to Inspector Slack quite so plainly," Miss Marlowe admitted, "because I was not sure I was entitled to draw that kind of conclusion. I'm not a medical person or a detective. I'm a writer of local histories." "My dear," said Miss Marple, with a warmth that was entirely genuine, "some of the most useful observations I have ever encountered have come from people who are not detectives. Detectives, in my experience, are sometimes too professionally accustomed to certain kinds of human behaviour to notice when the particular instance before them does not quite conform to the category." Miss Marlowe looked at her with an expression in which relief and something more complicated were jointly present. "You do not think it was suicide?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there are a great many things about the present circumstances that do not conform to the pattern one would expect, and when a great many small things fail to conform, it is generally worth asking why someone has gone to the trouble of arranging them." She turned her gaze toward the pavilion, visible in its customary position at the garden's far end, its climbing roses fully open in the morning light. "Tell me," she said, in a tone that shifted gently from the reflective to the practical, "during your conversations with Mr. Fenton about the history of the estate, did he speak at all about its financial arrangements, about property, investments, that sort of thing?" Miss Marlowe considered.